Hey everybody, it's me again, Professor H. We're going to take a look at Chapter 8, Part 2, which is for our Psychology 9 class, the Developmental Psychology. We're going to look at cognitive development in adolescence. We're going to take a look at cognition, education, and work. All right, let's get rolling. According to Piaget's theory of formal operations, that's the stage that we're going to be entering in adolescence. Remember, we had our sensory motor stage, we had our pre-operational stage, we had our operational stage, and now we're moving into formal operations. When the child reaches the formal operational stage, they can use something called hypothetical deductive reasoning. That is a more elaborate form of thinking where they can use kind of like the scientific process in order to solve a problem. They can think through it more methodologically and determine how to solve a problem. The image on the screen is something called the pendulum problem. And what happens in this particular task is that the child, the adolescent, is given different weights. So they're given different weights and they're given different lengths of string. And they are asked to determine what determines the speed of the pendulum. What makes it go back and forth at a particular speed? Is it changing the weight? Is it the length of the string? What is it? A child in the concrete operational period will go about trying to solve this problem kind of at a hit and miss, just try this, try that, without actually reasoning out how to solve the problem. And they may actually happen upon the correct answer, but once they have that correct answer, they may have difficulty explaining it. When the child has reached the formal operational stage and they can use that hypothetical deductive reasoning, they would go through the process in a more scientific way. So basically, they might want to just change one factor at a time and determine if that factor is what is the determining how quickly the pendulum swings. So that's just kind of a difference in the problem-solving strategy. Once the adolescent is reaching formal operations, they are having a more sophisticated way of thinking and problem solving. Some critiques of Piaget's theory. I know we always go with these critiques. There are a lot of individual differences. So there is a possibility that a child or adolescent may reach formal operations in one area or aspect of life, but maybe not demonstrate that in another area of life. Adolescents that have been trained in mathematics and science courses are more likely to exhibit this type of problem solving. If a child has not had extensive math and science training, they may not go about the problem solving in the same way. This leads to cultural differences. In some cultures, it may not be relevant to learn, say, the scientific method. If you are in a society, I believe your book talks about Inuits, and part of their society, what they need to be able to do in adolescence to become a useful member of their society and a productive member of their society is the ability to hunt. So somebody who's trained in maybe tracking the animal, hunting techniques, where they should try to hunt, they are maybe not going to solve the problem of creating a successful hunt in the same way that somebody would solve the pendulum problem. So in a lot of traditional cultures, adolescents would not be as successful in solving this type of Piagetian task. The success of the task has to be relevant to the culture in order for them to demonstrate that type of learning. For example, in the hunting example, say the adolescent went out and they had an unsuccessful hunt, they might go ahead and take a look at several factors that may have led to the unsuccessful hunt. And then they might systematically evaluate it and determine what factor they think is the most likely to have caused a failed hunt, change that factor, go out and try again. So in other words, the task has to be relevant to the culture. Attention and memory expand and improve in adolescence. The adolescents have more ability to perform tasks of selective attention and divided attention. Selective attention is when you have to focus on one thing at the exclusion of irrelevant stimuli. In adolescence, these kids have more ability to do this than a younger child. Divided attention is when you have to do more than one thing at a time. In adolescence, there is a greater ability to divide attention and be able to do two tasks at once. Memory also improves, especially long-term memory. The use of mnemonics, and obviously they've had a lot of training by this point of what's going to work for them to memorize things, especially if we're talking about an academic setting, how they learn knowledge, how they retain the information. They've developed a lot of strategies by this period of time to make it all work for them. The other big thing is that in order to remember things, it's most beneficial to be able to link it to knowledge that you already have. So our adolescent has a great deal more knowledge than our child in early childhood or middle childhood. So those experiences and knowledge that the child already possesses make it easier to link new information to that old information and kind of draw that into long-term memory. In addition, executive function improves, decision-making, problem-solving, all of those things improve. There is something called the imaginary audience that we see occurring with children in adolescence. The imaginary audience, I'm just going to kind of give you an idea of what it would be. So, and these are examples. The imaginary audience is one example of what we would call adolescent egocentrism. Say I'm a adolescent and I'm walking into my classroom and I have a stain on my shirt. I am going to think that every single person in that classroom is staring at me, and they're staring directly at that stain on my shirt, and they're going to be talking about that stain on my shirt, and they're going to be just focused on that. So that is the imaginary audience. It is a limited ability to distinguish between their own thinking and the thoughts of others. So I'm self-conscious about the stain on my shirt, so I'm thinking that everybody else is looking at me. Most likely that's not the case. Most likely nobody's really paying attention to whether or not I have a spot on my shirt. The imaginary audience is something that excuse me, that diminishes with age and with time. However, it doesn't ever really go away all the way. All right, and this tendency of the imaginary audience is possibly enhanced through social media, because people engage in a lot of social media these days, which kind of makes themselves the center of attention, and it can encourage those feelings of the imaginary audience. The next topic is called the personal fable. And once again, this is a type of adolescent egocentrism. The personal fable is that strong belief in uniqueness of self-experience. It can lead to anguish and high-risk behavior. For example, the personal fable can lead to adolescents believing that negative consequences from taking risks won't apply to them. For example, I can text and drive. I'm better at this than other people, so I'm not going to have any problem with it. Oh yeah, I can have 3 beers and still drive home fine. It's no problem. I'm really good at this. I'm better than other people at this. My parents are the worst. They don't let me do anything, and I have such a worse life than anyone else. So that's another example of a personal fable. And so that's just another way that adolescents exhibit adolescent egocentrism. Okay, when we talk about learning, we might want to refer back to Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky was somebody who promoted the idea that learning is basically a social process, and it always takes place in a social process. The most influential ideas of Vygotsky are the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. In earlier videos, I referred to this as, okay, so that in order for the kid to learn to tie their shoe, they first of all have to be in that zone of proximal development. They have to be able to manipulate their fingers well enough to work the laces, and they have to be able to follow the directions. So once they're at that point and they can do those things, then you can scaffold the behavior for them. You can walk them through it, you can build on it. Like have them do the first part of the tie, and then you help them with the second part. Pretty soon, they're starting to do the second part on their own. They've seen how you do it. Now they're going to try to do it on their own. So that's scaffolding, where you're just building on the previously learned task. And this is something that we see in adolescents that are moving towards adulthood, where they are in a social setting. Scaffolding is being used to teach them the skills and things that they need to become a successful adult within their culture. An example of scaffolding is, this is a image from your book also. This is an adolescent girl in a traditional culture learning from an adult. Here, it's a girl in Ghana who's learning to weave baskets. So at first, they would be given every single step, watched over and guided. And then pretty soon they'll be able to do part of the process on their own. And then you'd have to step in and guide them with finishing it. Pretty soon, you know, the scaffolding would occur. They would build on previous learning until they finally have this task that they can do on their own. And this is important for learning all kinds of things that will be important for adulthood, especially in the traditional cultures. Secondary school, we're talking about going to like high school now. This tradition is challenging for adolescents. It is socially and academically challenging. Attendance is a lot lower in developing countries for secondary school, and graduation rates vary by ethnic groups within the United States. This graph shows high school completion rates by ethnic group. This is, I think, a 2017 graph. Asian Americans have the highest graduation rates with like 90%. Whites follow that with somewhere between some close, you know, over 95, I mean, over 85% somewhere. Latinos are the next group, and then African American, and then Native American. So this is just looking at completion rates. There are international variations in secondary school systems. The US, Canada, and Japan have only one system. Most countries have many kinds of schools. For example, in Europe, excuse me, so basically our structure is basically you go to high school, you learn all the academic stuff, but there's not always an internship or something involved with that. In a lot of European countries, there are different tracks that kids might get on. They might be on a university track, which is a preparatory school for sending them on to university. They may be on a vocational school track where they will do an internship and their education will be geared towards that vocation. They may do a professional school, say maybe a business school, something like that, where they're going to do an internship with a particular company. And the education that they receive in their secondary school system is going to be, once again, geared towards that professional career that they are going to be in. Enrollment in developed countries is the norm. So that is pretty much an expected thing in developed countries for people to go to high school or that secondary school. In developing countries, it is difficult to attend secondary school. There are low graduation rates. Basically, a lot of times kids that are in adolescence are expected to work and contribute to the family. We talked about that a little bit earlier in an earlier video. There are gender differences, and part of the gender differences is in a lot of traditional cultures, women are not educated. That is on the rise, however. These days, when it comes to education, both males and females in a large number of countries are educated. Enrollment is increasing for secondary school in developing countries, but it is still pretty low. That is due to insufficient funding, lack of teachers, and overcrowding in their classrooms. Secondary school enrollment worldwide, this is a image that shows like United States, Europe over here. These are countries where secondary school enrollment is the norm. So we're talking more than 90%. If we look down here in South America, we're looking at about 76 to 96%. And then we move here, a couple little areas in Central America, and some of the Central America up here is 51 to 75%. Several other areas of the world we're looking at here are down to that anywhere from 26 to 0%. And then the white areas are no data. So it is not a universal thing. Even though we think of it as universal in the United States, it is not a universal thing that happens throughout the world. All right. Developed countries perform better than developing countries in both reading and math. Eastern schools focus more on rote learning, where Western schools emphasize critical thinking and creativity. So there are some differences in the approaches to the education in secondary school. When we take a look at the reading and math scores across several countries of 15-year-olds, we can see that Japan is leading in mathematics, and Canada is probably leading in reading, but they are trailing behind Japan in their mathematics. Japan is just a little bit behind Canada in the reading. And then we have, so it goes Japan, Canada, Germany, United States, and then we start hitting some of these other countries like Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, and Tunisia. So United States is kind of on the lower performance end when it comes to developing countries. In a lot of Asian countries, there is a strong pressure to perform. In middle school, children are pressed very hard because of, it is very important that they perform well academically so that they can get into the best schools, because their schools are competitive and you have to be able to perform well in order to get to a good school. So there's a lot of pressure in the Asian countries. Once they get into college, however, when they make it up to the level where they're going to college, they have a period of time where they're kind of more laid back than we are here in the United States. They've like put all this effort in, laying all that groundwork, and then they start college and they have like the first couple of years that it's a little more laid back than it is in the Western colleges. Adolescents work in developing countries. Okay, many types of work begin in middle school. We talked about that previously. However, in adolescence is when we see a huge spike in prostitution. This is a career that is often undertaken either voluntarily or involuntarily. Sometimes girls are taken and promised jobs and things, and then they are sex trafficked, basically. A lot of these Asian countries have a big problem with adolescent sex workers, and most of the consumers of this product are from Western countries. So basically, people from Western countries are going over to these Asian countries to have sex with these adolescent prostitutes. Also, there's a great deal of commercial sexual exploitation, and that occurs also, as I said, you know, maybe the family has been promised that she's going to have a job in the city, and then she goes, and it turns out that actually she's being sexually exploited. Adolescent work in developed countries is a little bit different. It is not typically related to supporting the family. It is more related to supporting leisure activities that the teen may have. It could negatively impact development. Some studies show that if an adolescent works over 10 hours weekly, it can have a negative impact on their development and their school performance. And I believe this is our last slide. This is a slide of how the apprenticeships work in Europe. So these apprentices, as I mentioned, there's these different tracks that they would go to when it's time for their secondary school, basically kind of like the high school. So when it's time for them to go to high school, they're either going to be on that college track, a professional track, or a like a trade that they're going to learn. They enter this at the age of 16. They continue going to school part-time and working on their internships the other part of the time. Training takes place in the workplace, and it is a preparation for a career in a respected profession. And these kids are prepared for careers that are going to help them be financially stable. So this is a picture of apprentices in a German automobile factory, which is a respected job and a well-paying job in Germany. All right, so that's it for our cognitive section. And please email me your questions and concerns, and I will get back to you as quick as you can. I hope you have a lovely day and that you are staying safe and healthy. Take care.